Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist worldwide.
We are winding down the final days of 2013. I don't know about you, but this year just seems to have flown by. I look back and it's all a blur. I heard somebody say once that life is like a roll of toilet paper. It just goes faster and faster and faster as you get closer to the end. So every year seems to be just rolling by faster. I don't know what that's about. Because next week is the Christmas holiday week, a lot of folks are going to be out traveling and just sort of focused elsewhere. We are not going to do a show next Tuesday night, which is our regular time. That'll be the Christmas Eve holiday. Instead, we're going to do an extra show this week, tomorrow night. So it's 2 podcasts in 2 days. Tomorrow evening, we're talking about the best and worst of 2013. And this can be the best and worst when it comes to atheism, atheist activism, science discoveries and progress, religion, religious figures, politicians, the best and worst of the year. And of course, we want your opinions and your nominations and your stories and your perspectives for that show. And that's going to happen tomorrow night. So we're going to do like a year in review, the highlights and the lowlights. So make sure and join us for that if you can. My guest this evening is an internationally known theoretical physicist and cosmologist. He is foundation professor at the School of Earth and Space Exploration and Physics Department at Arizona State University, and he's director of the Origins Project there. He's been called a public intellectual by Scientific American. He's authored more than 300 scientific publications, and he has received awards too numerous to mention on the show tonight, but I will say he's the only physicist to have received major awards from all 3 U.S. physics societies. He's authored 9 books, including the bestseller The Physics of Star Trek and A Universe from Nothing. And most recently, he's been featured on the big screen with Professor Richard Dawkins for the documentary film called The Unbelievers, which is being shown in select cities all across the globe. In fact, right now and through the 19th of this month, it's being shown in New York City at the Quad Cinema on 13th Street, and we're hoping for a much wider release or ultimately a release on Netflix in the coming months or years. So keep your eyes and ears open for that. For details on the film, you can just go to unbelieversmovie.com. Anyway, I'm delighted to have this distinguished guest on the radio tonight, Professor Lawrence Krauss. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be there.
What exactly is a theoretical physicist? I mean, explain it to the layperson.
A theoretical physicist does 2 things. One, we try and build models of the world that can be tested by experimentalists that help us understand both how the world works. It allows us to predict better how it will work, and therefore allows us to build and make new devices and new technologies that change the world. That's one side of it. We make models that can be tested. But the other thing we try and do often is explain things that are observed. Experimentalists often observe things that are surprising. That's why we continue to study the world, because it tends to surprise us. And when they do, sometimes the existing theories don't really explain it. And so we then try and look at the data and try and come up with an explanation that might explain the data. But again, it's not a story, because we then make predictions based on that explanation that can then be tested, and usually they're wrong.
What do you mean they're wrong? I mean, every time you guys throw something together, you have to go back and correct it 10 years later, 5 years later?
Well, we come up with beautiful ideas, but nature very rarely follows them. I mean, I've come up with lots of beautiful theories of how the universe might work, but nature, for whatever reason, wasn't wise enough to listen to me. And when those ideas are tested, they don't conform to reality. So most theoretical ideas are wrong. Just like many first-time experiments are performed, they're often wrong in the sense that, statistics often gives you spurious results. So it's really important that we're just not free. As Richard Feynman said, science is imagination in a straitjacket. As a theorist, I get paid to imagine lots of wonderful realities, but only one of them in principle conforms to the one we live in. And there's the rub, as we'd say, because that's the hard work, is to find out which one really conforms to reality.
One of the major criticisms I hear from theists, especially in regard to science is always having to go back and revise itself. And look, science was wrong about this, and they had to go and publish a correction or an update or a revision. How do you address that? Someone comes to you and they say, look, you just admitted most of the time you're wrong. I mean, how do you speak to that?
Well, first of all, it's called learning. It's something the theists have never heard of. Discovering you're wrong means that you learn something new. And so science doesn't completely revise itself. That's a big misunderstanding. It's probably the biggest misunderstanding of science. Revolutions in science don't do away with everything that went before them. Newton's laws of motion are still true today, just as when that's 350 years ago. They'll still describe the motions of baseballs and cannonballs. And as I often say, a million years from now, if that's the next time the Cleveland Indians are in the World Series, a baseball hit by one of their batters will follow a trajectory described by Newton's laws. Now, Newton's laws have been supplanted at the large scales by general relativity and at small scales by quantum mechanics, but they're not wrong. What we discover has to conform to the evidence of reality, and if a theory like Newton's theory explains the motion of baseballs and cannonballs, then any new theory that we have has to be consistent with that theory in the limit of large masses or slow speeds or whatever. So science doesn't revise itself completely, but new results occur all the time. And as I say, that is the wonderful thing about science, because we don't know the answer. We don't presume to know the answers before we even ask the questions. Where theorists have the ultimate truth, which means they know the answers. Well, and whenever you have someone who knows the answers, invariably they're wrong, because nature determines what the correct answer is, not what we like or what we hope for or anything else. And so it really is the process of learning, and we should be proud of the fact that we can be wrong and change our minds. That is a wonderful feature of being human, and as I say, is unfortunately generally not a feature of organized religion.
So you don't subscribe to truth with a capital T, truth. There is an absolute truth.
Well, there may be, but science doesn't deal in absolute truths. There's no scientific theory that's true for all scales at all times. All theories, in some sense, are effective theories that apply to certain parts of nature. And we don't have a theory of everything. Maybe someday we will, that works on all scales at all times, but there's no evidence we're going to get there. And so science doesn't prove things to be true. What science does is prove things to be false. That's all you can do. You perform an experiment, you test an idea, and if the predictions of the idea disagree with the experiment, then the idea is simply false. End of story. Throw it out like yesterday's newspaper, regardless of how beautiful it is. Now, if the idea agrees with the results of the experiment, it doesn't say the idea is true. It says there's some nugget of truth to the idea, but you may refine your experiments and find out the idea has to be revised a little bit. So all it does is tell you that the idea isn't false. But not being false is not the same as being true.
Talking here with Professor Lawrence Krauss. In your speech this last summer at the Oklahoma Free Thought Convention, you did kind of a riff on the greatest story ever told, which from your perspective is sort of the story of science, right? And you specifically tied it into recent work on the Higgs field. Can we talk a little bit about Higgs, what it is, why it's important, that kind of thing?
And then it forms the basis of, or beginning of a new book I'm writing, in fact, actually, which will follow up on that theme.
Why do they call it the God particle? And is that even an appropriate moniker for what it is for the rest of us?
No one calls it the God particle but the media. And maybe Leon Letterman, who decides to sell some books by calling it that. But what he meant by that is that the Higgs particle, well, as I described in that lecture, is at the basis, in some sense, of the standard model of particle physics, which is the greatest intellectual edifice that humans have ever developed. It describes all the known forces of nature, well, three of them in detail, the electromagnetic, the weak, and the strong force, and it agrees with essentially every experiment ever performed. But it does so only if you make a rather radical assumption that there is this invisible field existing throughout the universe, in the absence of which all particles would be massless. But some particles interact with that field more strongly and get more resistance and act heavier, and other ones interact with the field less strongly and act lighter. And so if you wish, the observed masses of most particles is kind of an accident of our circumstances. If the Higgs field wasn't there, the particles would be massless and we wouldn't exist. So in that sense, the Higgs field is responsible for our existence. But that's just a story. And inventing invisible fields that you can't see is the subject of religion, not science. And so that story has to be tested. And one of the predictions is, for every field in physics, there's an elementary particle associated with it. And if you slap the vacuum hard enough, the prediction is that you'll actually produce real particles coming from that field. And that's what we did in the Large Hadron Collider. And to my personal amazement, the Higgs actually exists. Because I thought the picture was just a little too slimy, a little too slippery to be real, and that nature would surprise us some other way. But it seems to be real. It is kind of amazing every now and then when we can anticipate nature.
So someone essentially made a guess about it, and they just happened to be right. Is that accurate?
Well, yes, it was much more than a guess. It was an educated guess, and not only that, following up on that mathematical educated guess, you produced a model which otherwise explained everything. And, the standard model, the weak interaction, all of it is only consistent if the Higgs field existed. So it was a very good educated guess. But it could have been wrong, even though it almost seems too good to be true. And it isn't.
Were you involved in the original development of the Hadron Collider? Were you a part of sort of the mechanism putting it all together?
No, I would like to say I was, but no, I'm a theorist, of course, and they wouldn't want to let me near it. Well, I've been near it. I've been down there and with the devices. So I've been involved in thinking about what it might do and what it might see, and proposing to experimentalists things they might measure. And I've been involved in that saga for a long time, long before the Large Hadron Collider was ever the Large Hadron Collider. I used to go down to Waxahachie, Texas, to what was then called the Superconducting Super Collider, and it was being built in this country in the early 1990s to do exactly what the Large Hadron Collider is doing. But unfortunately, Congress, in their infinite wisdom, and they seemed smart back then by comparison to the Congress now, nevertheless stupidly canceled the project.
Now, it's closed right now. I think they have a plan to reopen in 2015. What's the story? I mean, what are they hoping to accomplish then? Or is some kind of upgrade underway, or what?
Yeah, it's been shut down for an upgrade because the Higgs is just the beginning. There's lots of questions. Even if the Higgs exists, we don't understand why it has the mass it does, why the weak interaction has the strength it does, why it settled in this configuration it did in the early universe that caused everything to have mass. All of those questions are open questions, and we have a lot of ideas for answers. We physicists have been flailing around with like century-deprived people in a tank, hallucinating for the last 40 years, and we've made a lot of hallucinations, and now's the time to test them. And most of these hallucinations imply exciting new observations that will be made at the Large Hadron Collider, be it a whole set of new particles called supersymmetric particles, which might, by the way, explain the dark matter in the universe. Or some people have even proposed the existence of extra dimensions that might be observed at the Large Hadron Collider, although I think it's probably wrong. It's a very ugly idea.
Talk to me about dark matter. What is it?
The immediate answer is we don't know. We're trying to find out what it is specifically, but in a general sense, it's just matter, a kind of matter that doesn't interact with light. And therefore, in some sense, is not visible. It only interacts gravitationally with other matter. Now, there are already particles like that we know of, particles called neutrinos, that come from the sun. Right now, 10,000 billion neutrinos are going through every square centimeter of your body every second. And they go right through the Earth without even knowing it was there because they interact so weakly. Now, they'd be great candidates for dark matter, but we can actually calculate how many of them there are in the universe now, and also we put limits on their mass. And unfortunately, they're not massive enough to be dark matter. So we think there are other particles out there, like neutrinos, but presumably heavier, that were produced in the early universe. And what it means is that 90% of the mass in our galaxy and all other galaxies is made up of something other than the stuff that makes you and I up, some new type of elementary particle. And what makes that exciting is not only could we try and detect it directly here in the laboratories on Earth, deep underground laboratories that are now being built or have been built to look for it, but also for a number of these particles, we could actually produce them at the Large Hadron Collider. So there's a race between the two to see who might detect, if you wish, the stuff of the universe. And of course, or maybe all our ideas are wrong. We'll have to find out.
Talking here with Lawrence Krauss. I'll play apologist for a second and set up the theme of your most recent book. How does something come from nothing?
The quick answer is quite easily, thank you. The big mystery, the big sort of religious mystery, the one that, the life used to be a miracle, and then the diversity of life is a miracle, and then the origin of life is a miracle. But we tend to think those aren't miracles anymore. But the one thing that seems miraculous is how do you get 100 billion galaxies, each of which contains 100 billion stars in a universe? Where did all that come from? How can you create all that stuff without some divine intervention? And the answer is that the laws of physics allow you to create all that stuff from no stuff. Namely, you can create all the matter from no matter, starting out with empty space. And you can even create the space itself using the laws of quantum mechanics and gravity. And if you ask the question, what would a universe that was created from nothing by known laws of physics or known or inferred laws of physics, what would it look like? And the answer is it would look just like the universe in which we live. Does that prove it happened? No, but it makes it eminently plausible, and that is worth celebrating, which is why I wrote a book about it. The laws of quantum mechanics tell us that empty space isn't so empty. Even if there's nothing there to see, there's still stuff happening. And if you wait long enough, particles will pop out of empty space. And the entire energy of our universe could be precisely zero. And if that's the case, our universe is the ultimate free lunch. Because if the entire energy of our universe is zero, then quantum processes could create a universe like ours, and then with some refinements could cause it to exist for 15 billion years or 14 billion years. And then it would look just like our universe. And that's the saga of how that could happen is, of course, what I talk about at length in the book. And I'm obviously not going to go through all of that detail here.
Well, I'll make sure and link the book in the description box of this video. Do you think humankind ever has a shot at genuinely knowing how the universe began? And we will ever figure it out and have that aha moment? Yes, this is what caused the singularity and the Big Bang. Do you think we'll ever just totally definitively figure it out?
Who knows? I mean, we don't know what the limits to science are. The only thing we can do is keep trying. Everyone always says, well, we don't understand it, and therefore we'll never understand it. But there's a big difference between not understanding something and never understanding something. And all we can do is keep trying. We may never understand it, but we just keep plugging away. And so far, we haven't hit the limits. We just keep going. And your guess is as good as mine.
I had to say, just thank you for a clip I saw on YouTube of you in Australia. I think it was Brisbane at the City Bible Forum event. It was you and William Lane Craig and I think a few other people on stage. You did a 20-minute opener on that speech. That is one of the most satisfying clips I've ever seen on YouTube. I mean, you were so, I mean, you were respectful, but you gave no quarter to William Lane Craig, specifically in what you said was distortion and misrepresentation. You said this, quote, Dr. Craig's a fine gentleman, I'm sure, and a wonderful husband, father, and so on, but probably so is George Bush. But that didn't change the fact that I detested the lies and distortions associated with his administration, and I detest the lies and distortions that have been associated with William Lane Craig, and I can't hide that. So you're talking about the creationist position in general, or his comments on the film, The Unbelievers?
I was talking about a number of things. And by the way, I'm glad you think I was respectful. Many people don't. I got a lot of hate mail. But
well, I mean, you weren't kind to the man. But I mean, you just said it outright. No apology. You just said it matter-of-factly. This man has been intellectually dishonest with the public, and you just said it outright. I thought it was a gutsy move, and I thought it was well played. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Gutsy. It was probably one of the harder things I've done. It's very hard before 2,000 people to call someone a liar. But in this case, there were a number of, of course, his reviews of a movie he hadn't seen were, of course, distortions because he hadn't seen it. And he made things up and then never bothered to say that he hadn't seen it or made them up. But more generally, he distorts science. And I have had the experience of previously of being on stage with him when I didn't know anything about him and assumed he was kind of an honest but misguided intellectual. And now I saw the scam that was happening, and I was taken aback, and it wasn't going to happen again. So I think it's important to call out nonsense where it is. And it does, as I say, it's not a comment on him. It's a comment. In fact, by the end of I had 3 debates with him, discussions with him. By the end of it, I kind of thought maybe he isn't honest. He isn't dishonest on purpose. He's just so committed to this truth that he thinks is true that anything that gets in the way, he distorts. So I think it's his fundamentalism, if you wish, that drives him and not any desire necessarily to be disingenuous. Although, who am I to decide what people's desires are or not? But I think I wanted to attack his ideas and not so much the man, but of course, the two often go together. And I think his claims about what science can do and the logic of what scientists are doing are fallacious in almost every way. And, I didn't even want to do it because most people don't even know who he is. And, a lot of times people want to debate people like me or Richard Dawkins or whatever so they can get on stage with them and in some sense raise their profile. And it happens to me with people who believe in UFOs all the time. They want to get on stage with me. And so I'm pretty careful about it. But in this case, I thought this is someone who's said a lot of things with impunity, a lot of distortions and lies, and someone has to call him on it. So I did.
Creation Ministries they just said it outright. I brought this to light in many of the presentations I've done, that they say, anything that does not essentially fit in Scripture must be discarded. No matter what evidence they bring, if it doesn't fit inside this cookie cutter here, we simply don't look or listen. And I think Craig may be guilty of that. He just starts with the answer and then begins asking the question. That's a guess, but it
starts with the answer, and therefore I think Craig is a little bit different. Craig's saying, I know the answer, but science. I think he kind of believes science, but he says, since I know the answer, the science must give me the answer I'm looking for, and therefore I'll just try and interpret the science in a way that gives me the answer I wanted, which is not how it works. As Richard Feynman once again said, when you have an idea, use science to try and prove it wrong as well as right. Otherwise, you're not doing science.
I'm amazed that when I look at the YouTube clips, I'll watch the same clip of the same debate, and depending on where it's posted, it's Lawrence Krauss destroys William Lane Craig, followed by William Lane Craig destroys Lawrence Krauss in science debate. They watch the exact same content and come to an absolutely opposite conclusion. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I think, and people say, why do you do it? The point is, I'm not trying to reach those people, because those people will never change their minds no matter what you say. But what I'm trying to do, and what I hope to do at that event, which I didn't even plan to be online, it wasn't supposed to be taped, but anyway, was reach the people, the 2,000 people in the audience, maybe 1,000 of whom hadn't really thought about these issues and were just honestly interested in listening. And those people can be swayed by distortions and misunderstanding by people who claim with great confidence to know what they're talking about. And those are the people I'm trying to reach. So yeah, of course, you can be damn sure whenever, and it's the last time I'll ever do it, but whenever you're on stage with someone like William Lane Craig, you can be darn sure that right afterwards his spin people will immediately talk about how devastating his arguments were. It's sort of like after any presidential debate, after all, the same kind of spin happens.
You segue perfectly into my next segment here. You've debated a lot of people like William Lane Craig, John Lennox, Dinesh D'Souza. I saw you countering Michael Behe on TV back in 2005. You're on TV on the NewsHour. Now, he's a biochemist and a Christian, and he, of course, sells intelligent design everywhere he goes, and pitching why it belongs in science classrooms. So, you're no stranger to the debate arena with these guys. You've been going head-to-head for many years, yes?
Yeah, it's a learning experience, and sometimes you do it wrong, and, it's each time you learn. But Michael Behe is easy because he's his own worst enemy, because he's actually an honest fellow. He believes what he says, and he says the stupidest thing. And so, he'll even sort of contradict. He'll go to the point of saying, well, life was designed, but maybe it was aliens. Of course, but then he sets himself up for saying, who designed the aliens? And so I think Michael Behe, there's some people, I think, the kind of people who are honest about what they think are in some sense sometimes a pleasure to debate, because at least they have intellectual honesty. They may be misguided, but at least they're intellectually honest. I just had a very pleasant encounter with someone I respect a lot, George Coyne, who was the Vatican astronomer, and there was an event in Minnesota we were both at, a Nobel event, actually. And I think if you watch that, I think you'll see, I think, that I take his position down. But he's an honest man who thinks deeply, and it's enjoyable to talk to him. And those kind of people are sort of fun. Now, there are other people like, I think, Dinesh D'Souza and Craig and some others who are much more slippery, who are experts at rhetorical devices and not content. And those people are much less pleasant to debate because their goal, they have an agenda, which is to convince people of their ideas and to use whatever tools they have to do that. And the truth really goes by the wayside. And so, it isn't always a pleasant experience. And I don't like doing it much. And I'd say no to most of them. But I think especially after my late friend Christopher Hitchens has died, and he used to do a lot of them, I think people look for someone else.
Well, I think people are glad you're out there representing true science instead of what was written about thousands of years ago by goat herders. It empowers the rest of it.
Yeah, but I'd much rather just give a lecture on science than debate nonsense.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's life.
Well, I mean, I was talking to Dawkins a couple months ago about how I think he laments the fact that so many people lead with atheist rather than scientist. I mean, you're a scientist first.
Yes, I am. I don't label myself by anything else. I do label myself as a scientist when I'm doing science. When I'm not doing science, I may not be much of a scientist, but I don't label myself as an atheist or anything else. I don't label myself by the things, certainly don't label myself by the things I don't believe. I don't like those kind of labels. I just did a program with some interesting people, New Covenant group, I guess, and they were talking about atheists and theists, and as if there was some distinction. It's just individuals and atheists are just people who, it's not a belief system. It can't be compared to theism. It's just people who want to base their ideas on the evidence of experience and rational thought. And anyway, so I don't label myself as an atheist. I know I get labeled it, but I certainly don't label myself that way.
But you don't hold to any God. I mean, you don't believe in any deity anywhere for any reason.
Yeah, but you can label me as a Santa Clausist as well. You can label me, and that doesn't seem very productive.
Yeah, I get it. Well, I mean, I don't see him pushing Santa Claus in science class. The battles that we're facing, at least here in the United States, are with theists, largely Christian, who are selling creationism, intelligent design, the words of the 66 books of the Bible as absolute fact, under penalty of hell if you reject it. And so I think that's why many of us claim the title atheist, non-theist. We don't buy it, and we don't want it force-fed in our public schools or to our children, or we don't want to be threatened with hell. I think that's why many of us embrace the term. So,
of course, that's why I do. You think I would do these things if it wasn't for that? You're absolutely right. I don't, if people force-fed Santa Claus and cruel children, then I would be doing the same thing. It's because the only reason I'm out there doing this is because people are utilizing that to distort reality and cause people to either fear things they shouldn't fear or make bad decisions. I don't care what my friend of mine, Noam Chomsky, said to me once, he didn't care what people thought, it's what people do. And that's the point. I don't really care what misimpressions people have, except for the fact that those misimpressions can produce behavior which is irrational. And when people are trying to interfere with the education of young people, which I call child abuse, then that's how I got into this in the first place, into this sort of debate, if you wish. I'd obviously been writing about the science of public policy for a while ago, and I forget exactly what year, but in maybe around 2000, maybe earlier, in Ohio, the Discovery Institute was trying to push intelligent design into the high schools, and I was shocked that the biologists weren't speaking out, and I had a public voice, so I started to speak out, and then there was a big event the state school board had, and anyway, we actually won that, but that's how I got involved in all this, because I believe that we owe it to our children to not only get them excited about the universe, but to help encourage their open questioning and thinking, because it'll make the future better. And when people try and interfere with the education of our children, it gets me riled up.
I remember seeing, was it you on a Big Think video where you said it outright? Religion or teaching creationism to children is child abuse?
I said it, and I did a lot of Fox News interviews after that.
Well, I know. It's funny. What I'm saying is, for the intelligent design crowd, the bad guy these days seems to be the scientist. I mean, they've got Bill Nye, the science guy, in the crosshairs. And I think to myself, could there be a more innocuous guy, a guy who's out there he's positive, he's proactive, teaching good science, and he is an agent of Beelzebub? It just boggles the mind.
Well, I mean, I think what happened is that, Bill actually did another Big Think video where he basically said, just keep creationism out of the classroom, and that made him the enemy. We're vilified for many reasons. I've come to appreciate a lot more my friend Richard Dawkins in the years since I first knew him, because we are immediately vilified as being strident and militant and just for asking questions and pointing out that certain things may be nonsense. And I get, in my book, A Universe of Nothing, there's very few pages that actually talk, maybe 3, in which the word God might be mentioned. But I'm called a strident atheist when I just ask the question, is it possible to create a universe without God? Just asking the question makes you strident. And so anytime you speak out, you're attacked, because they need to attack you. They need to undermine you, because they're trying to constantly sway an otherwise uninformed public. And by vilifying you, the same way, and I'll be political here, the same way the Republican Party often spouts lies over and over again, because people who are otherwise not informed begin to believe them when they hear them often enough. And that's what these people do as their strategy. They try and undermine the credibility of people because that's all they have, really.
Have you gotten letters or correspondence from people who said, hey, I read a book, heard a talk, and I fell in love with science? You know, you inspired me to explore the universe, that kind of thing. I mean, you probably get those correspondence all the time, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds self-serving, but I get them literally every day. I mean, that's what, in some sense, emboldens me to continue. When someone says, I heard a debate, or I read a book, it inspired me. I used to be the fundamentalist, or I used to do this. It inspired me to learn about the universe, and that's what it's all about. And I'm very honored to have that opportunity.
Well, the thing about us as civilians is that we tend to check out. At least I do, right? Theoretical physicists, geez, I can't participate in this discussion. Or when you get into, you hear Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about some amazingly complex thing, and you find yourself thinking, I can't participate. And we see all these people who are passing around these, deep conversations about science. We desperately want to participate. It seems like your work is pretty accessible. I read A Universe from Nothing, and I thought, it's a thick little book, but I'm not excluded because I'm not a member of the physics community. And I'm guessing you wrote it that way by design?
Of course. I mean, the point is that no one should be excluded. Any more than people should be excluded from art or music or literature. You don't have to be, that's the funny thing. You don't have to be a musician to enjoy music, right? You don't have to be an artist to enjoy art. Similarly, you don't have to be a writer to enjoy a good novel. But somehow, we give this perception that you have to be a scientist to appreciate science. And I hope that's not the case, and it isn't the case. These are the most beautiful ideas that humans have ever come up with. And we owe it to the public to disseminate them because it's part of what our culture is all about. And of course, we should all participate. And what I try and do is twofold, is first, motivate people to want to participate, and secondly, provide them the tools or the information that helps them participate to the extent they can, as honestly as I can. And it's a privilege to be able to do that. And it's a privilege, or more importantly, it's a privilege to have people listen. People often write me and say, I'm sorry to write you, or I'm sorry. They come up to me and say, I'm sorry to disturb you, and then tell me their story. And it's an honor for me to be so disturbed. You've
also probably received a lot of letters and correspondence from people who said, hey, I found the secrets to the universe. Just read my book or read my blog or watch my video or what have you. You probably get a lot of those people who feel like they've unlocked the secret and now they want to share the good news with you, huh?
I get those at least 5 times a day as well. And it usually goes along these lines, or often does. People thought Einstein was crazy. People think I'm crazy. Therefore, I'm Einstein. It's kind of like a William Lane Craig syllogism. And unfortunately, they're well-meaning, but and I try, and most of them are respectful, and I try and respond to each one of them if they're, honestly, and I tell them if they have an interesting idea to submit it for publication, and they'll get peer-reviewed. But unfortunately, especially in physics, there's just a tremendous amount of intellectual baggage. And so it's very difficult for quote-unquote amateurs, in fact, it's virtually impossible, for some random idea, without knowing all of the intellectual baggage about what's been tested over the last century, to really understand what even the questions are, or much less what possible answers are. Now, that's not to say it might not happen, and that's why I say submit it for publication. Maybe you've got a good idea, but I'm not in the business of reading unsolicited manuscripts, which I get by the dozens every day.
Well, how do we, the civilians, protect ourselves? I mean, somebody like Stephen Meyer comes up from the Discovery Institute, flashes a PhD and publishes a book that says design is evident even down at the cellular level. Just look. And then they present a whole host of evidence, and it's all very impressive looking on its surface. How do we, who are not scientists, know the difference between the people who are shilling for their God and people who are talking about genuine evidence-based science?
Well, first of all, you got to ask, where do they come from? What are they doing? What's their job? Is their job to promote this, or is their job just to explore science? I mean, someone like Stephen Meyer is paid by a group that lobbies for just this idea. So you've got to ask yourself suspiciously, okay, what's the motivation? Secondly, for better or worse, I mean, we can't all be experts of everything. We should. And one of the things I try and do is provide enough tools. We should be skeptical of everyone, of everything we read. And we should have enough tools, try and amass enough tools to get a sense of whether something makes sense or not. But, it's sometimes hard in the details to know that. So the last thing to do is to ask yourself, for better or worse, if this is a scientific idea, what's the scientific community's take on that idea? And then you look at a book by Stephen Meyer, or you look at a book by the National Academy of Sciences, which is the highest scientific body in the United States. And they have these, books on why this stuff is nonsense. And so you've got to ask yourself, which is more likely? I remember the very first person I debated on this subject on the radio many years ago was a guy whose name I forget. It's the same as an architect. He was a lawyer from Berkeley. He was the guy who created and initiated intelligent design. Johnson, I think his name was. But anyway, in the end, all I could do on the radio was say, he was talking about how intelligent design was everything and blah, blah, blah. And I said to, I used if you wish, maybe a rhetorical device, but I thought it was useful. I said to people, in the end, if you're uncertain about this stuff, you got to ask, who am I going to believe? The National Academy of Sciences or a lawyer?
Well,
and
so you're saying that the scientific community does a pretty effective job of policing itself.
We're not in the business of shaking hands with some hoods and all saying the same mantra. As I often say, that you become well known by proving your colleagues wrong. We're all trying to test each other's ideas. And if I write something that's wrong, you'll be damn sure my colleagues are going to find out. The worst critics are not these people, but your colleagues, because they're trying to vet your ideas to see if they're useful and build on them. And so, there's lots of crap that's written that appears in scientific journals. Not everything that's in scientific journals is right. A lot of it is wrong. But the wrong stuff doesn't survive. The right stuff gets tested, and eventually, that's what consensus means. Eventually, people test things and find out which ideas make sense and which don't, and follow up on them, which are useful. And so the scientific community is not in the business of saying, oh, we like evolution. We don't want anyone to attack evolution because we like it. I mean, that's just nonsense. If anyone could disprove evolution, they become famous. But it's been tested for 150 years, and it's more firmly grounded than gravity. So it's just not going to happen.
Talking here with Professor Lawrence Krauss. I've monopolized you for more than the first half of the show here. If you have a few minutes, I would like to go to the switchboard and let our callers volley some stuff at you. That'd be all right?
Yeah, sure.
Area code 636. Thanks for waiting. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
Hi, this is Brooke.
Brooke, thanks for calling. You're on the air with Lawrence Krauss. What do you have?
Hey, Lawrence. First, I just want to say thank you so much for everything you do. I've watched a lot of your videos in my astronomy class last year, and it's awesome to finally be talking to you.
Oh, well, it's great to be talking to you. You're not there. There was someone who tweeted that they were really excited tonight about talking to me. That wasn't you.
That was me.
I thought it was. I thought their name was Brooke. Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to meet you.
So my little question is, if you could, would you rather witness the start of the universe or the end of it?
I think the end, because the end takes a lot longer. I'd rather be around a lot longer.
I gotcha. I'd rather go with the start.
Well,
but that's awesome.
Well, I mean, from it, you're at. You know what? From an intellectual perspective, you're right, because most of the interesting stuff in the universe happened in the first second. More things happened in the first second in the history of the universe than will happen in the entire future of the universe, even if the future is infinitely long. So really, the interesting time was the first second. So from an intellectual perspective, and not a self-indulgent perspective, you're absolutely right. The beginning is where all the action is. The only reason I said it's the end is that it's longer, and I wanted to live longer. That's all.
Thanks, Brooke. My head just exploded.
That was a great question. You take care.
Thank you guys very much. Have a great night.
Thank you, Brooke. Take care. Area code 347. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
Oh, this is Sarah. Oh, my God. I'm so excited.
I'm so glad you made it on the radio. You're on the air with Dr. Lawrence Krauss. What do you have for us?
My question is, how do you feel about people who force their children to not believe in evolution?
Well, I've said it before, and I'm on this program, in fact, that it's child abuse. It's child abuse to withhold knowledge from your children. It's child abuse to withhold drugs or with medical care or anything that helps your child grow into an effective adult who can take advantage of the experience of being alive and be productive and happy and in terms of accomplishing the most they can accomplish. That's what we want to do as parents, is we want to empower our children to do whatever they want to do as well as they can do it. And withholding knowledge, feeling that if you feel something is such a great threat to your faith, that knowledge is such a great threat to your faith that you withhold it from your children, obviously you're doing them a disservice. It's no different than the Taliban do to children in Afghanistan. And it is child abuse. And, it's not child. And when people get shocked when I say that, obviously it's a different kind of child abuse than happens with, sexual molestation. But it's child abuse nevertheless. Now, all parents at some level, of course, abuse our children. We love to be perfect parents, and we're not. We sometimes do the wrong thing. But knowingly not allowing your children to be exposed to information for fear that it will change their minds is abuse.
Oh my God, I love you.
Thank you. I'm taking it already, but thank you.
Seriously, everybody wanted me to mention something about the bubbles on the blog, so...
We're hearing some kind of a Skype notification over the line, so I figured that's what that was. So
yeah, okay.
Very kind. Thank you so much for the call. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Couple more very quickly. Area code 308. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
This is Jacob from Nebraska.
Thanks for calling the show. You're on the air with Dr. Lawrence Krauss. What do you have for us?
Hey, Professor Krauss.
Hi.
Actually, you mentioned wanting to live longer. I'm wondering what you think about the technological singularity, like transhumanism.
Nah, I think that's a lot of talk.
Is it? Okay.
First of all, I mean, I think things are going to evolve tremendously, and I do think computers are potentially the next stage of conscious evolution. But this singularity stuff, I just think it's talk. And moreover, let me point out, the last thing in the world I would want to do is live forever. I can't think of any worse fate than that. Being stuck with my, as we say, being stuck with one's in-laws forever is bad enough. But your family. Can you imagine being stuck with your mother forever? I shouldn't say that. But forever is a long, long time. As Woody Allen says, eternity is a long time, especially near the end. And I think, therefore, I would not want to wish that on anyone. I find people think that heaven is wonderful because it might involve eternal life. Is just think about it. But of course, being able to thrive and live a full life and obviously make it longer at some level. But if you ask me now, what I would say is a maximum. I think people would want to live. I think it'd be getting pretty boring after 200 years or so. But anyway, bottom line is that technology is evolving tremendously, and computer power is evolving tremendously. And I suspect that I see no barrier to machines becoming conscious, perhaps, but I don't see that as being like the Terminator. And I think biological systems will inevitably have to integrate that into their development. And so who knows what the next stage will be, but the singularity stuff is just hype as far as I'm concerned.
Hey, thank you so much for the call. Much appreciated.
Yep, thank you.
Area code 812. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
I'm afraid my prayer was just answered. This is Sam.
Sam, thanks for calling the show. You're on the air with Lawrence Krauss. What do you have for us?
Hi. So I hear a lot of talk about all the laws that we know, that we think about, break down when you get back to near the beginning of the universe. So my question is, theists talk often about the cause of the universe being God. Is it even reasonable to think about there being a cause? Because causal relationships involve time. Time is one of the things that exists because the universe exists. It's one of our dimensions. I don't understand how we can assert there's a cause when we don't know there's time.
Well, you're absolutely right. I've said that very similar things on many occasions. We don't know, of course, the answer, because we don't know what the laws of physics are at t equals 0. But one thing we do know is that it's quite possible that because space and time are tied together, if the space in our universe was created, space-time was created. That means time actually was created at the instant the universe began, and the question of before may not make sense. And then you're absolutely right that the whole notion of cause and effect doesn't make sense if there is no before. Now, we don't know if that's true or not because we don't know if there was a before. We don't know if time somehow globally can be defined even before the singularity of the Big Bang. But it's quite possible that there was no before, in which case this whole notion of first cause that worries so many theorists is really a red herring, like many things, because it's based on the logic of our experience. And so what science has taught us is that the logic of our experience isn't always right. We have to question it. And that's what is so wonderful. As in the new movie that we just made, Richard Dawkins says very clearly that, we evolved in the Pleistocene in Africa to avoid lions and to learn how to hunt for food, not to understand quantum mechanics or relativity. And so these quote-unquote common sense notions, well, every effect must have a cause, may not be true. And the universe need not have a cause, and the whole notion of cause may be completely the wrong language. And we don't know, and that's the thing that's wonderful. We don't know, and people like me are lucky enough to get paid to try and figure out if we can answer that question.
Well, thank you very much for the answer. Real quick before I go, does it make sense then that any time that the prime mover argument comes up in an argument with a theist, that the correct answer to that type of argument would be to help them realize that it doesn't make sense to talk about it and to try to move on to something else?
Well, I haven't found that to be particularly useful in the sense that people who are convinced there's a first cause don't want to hear the possibility, but it's certainly worth mentioning as a possibility, and maybe you might at least get people thinking.
Thank you so much for the call. Greatly appreciated. Professor Lawrence Krauss, you mentioned you had a new book coming. Do we know what the tentative release date is next year?
I'm just in the early stages of writing, so it's going to be 2 years before, or maybe a year and a half or 2 years before you'll see it. So,
and it's going to be addressing the Higgs and things along those lines?
It'll take off where a universe of nothing finished in a way, and look at our wonderful intellectual saga that makes up the Standard Model and many other things. Professor Lawrence Krauss, I must admit the same thing I admitted to Richard Dawkins and several others. When I was a believer just 6 years ago, I had no idea who you were. You know what I'm saying? And I was introduced to you, your speeches, your book, A Universe from Nothing has just been amazing to me. And I have become a huge fan. And I just wanted to personally thank you. The way you present this stuff, I find myself smiling. I find myself wanting to know more, which is, I think, what good teachers do. They get people excited about the process of learning. So thank you for what you do in that regard, not just for me, but for literally thousands all around the world. Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity. It was fun, as usual. Thank you so much for listening this evening. Don't forget, tomorrow evening, we'll be doing an extra show this week to make up for the podcast we won't be doing during the holiday week next week. Tomorrow night, 6 o'clock Central, we're talking about the best and worst of 2013. And if you have a nomination, just send an email in to podcast@thethinkingatheist.com.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.